the Black Death, and quarantining with the Decameron. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, how many sprightly youths breakfasted in the morning with their kinsfolk, comrades, and friends, and that same night supped with their ancestors in the other world. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Decameron. Between 1346 and 1353, a horrifying pestilence burned across Central Asia, North Africa, and Europe. The infected, covered in blackened bubos and burning with fever, died in agony, often with no family left to care for them or priests to pray for their souls. In some areas, 50% of the population was wiped out, leaving whole villages deserted with no one to bury the dead. In the midst of this horror, Florentine Giovanni Boccaccio wrote his seminal work, the Decameron, about 10 young people who flee the plague for a lavish, sexy Tuscan Villa vacation and to hopefully not die. This medieval masterpiece has recently been turned into a darkly hilarious Netflix series, which further explores the class and gender dynamics of the 14th century, in a way anyone who recently lived through a worldwide pandemic can relate to. Today, let's explore the history and science behind the Black Death, the plague pandemics that came before and after it, and find out if this horrendous disease is still a risk today. Plus, we'll find out what the Decameron has to say about life, love, sex, and surviving the plague in 1348 and today. Let's begin with a little terminology. What is the plague? Plague is an infectious disease which we now know is caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. There are 3 forms of plague. Bubonic plague is the most common and is usually transmitted via the bite of a flea, or as a new theory suggests, lice, often carried by rats or other rodents. It can also be passed by close contact with infected humans or animals. Within 1 to 7 days of infection, a patient will experience chills, malaise, fever, muscle cramps, and seizures. Next, the most distinct symptom, painful lymph gland swellings called bubos in the neck, armpits, and groin. Necrosis of the flesh can cause the fingers, toes, lips, and nose to turn black. Untreated, bubonic plague has an 80% mortality rate. Patients usually die within 3 to 5 days of first symptom. Pneumonic plague affects the lungs and can be spread by airborne droplets when an infected person coughs or sneezes. Symptoms include fever, headache, shortness of breath, chest pain, and coughing. Catching pneumonic plague increases the death rate to 90%. Septicemic plague. In rare cases, the bacteria can infect the bloodstream. This means certain death within 24 hours of infection. What is the Black Death? A specific pandemic of plague between 1346 and 1353. At the time of the outbreak, it was called the Great Pestilence. But the worst pandemic in human history was later given the ominous title, the Black Death, referring to both the black necrotic flesh of its victims and the utter darkness of the time. While the Black Death is the most storied bubonic plague pandemic, it was neither the first nor the last. Modern research suggests that Yersinia pestis bacteria evolved into a state which could infect humans in the Tian Shan Mountains on the border of present-day Kyrgyzstan and China. The disease likely decimated late Neolithic communities, but spread slowly as trade and warfare were just beginning to connect distant populations. Still, the plague managed to reach quite far. In 2018, archaeologists excavating a tomb in Sweden from around 3000 BCE found evidence of Yersinia pestis in the ancient bones. This may be an explanation for the significant drop in European population, known as the Neolithic decline. Symptoms of bubonic plague were first recorded in Greek medical texts around 100 CE. In 541, the Byzantine Empire was struck by the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. This time, the world was far better connected. Fleas carrying Yersinia pestis infected the nomadic Huns who traded with and raided parts of the Roman and Byzantine empires. It is believed that the plague reached Egypt, where it was carried by flea-infested rats on board ships to Constantinople. The capital's many granaries were an all-you-can-eat buffet for the rodents. As they thrived and multiplied, the disease spread quickly among the human population. Each day, 5,000 people died, totaling 40% of Constantinople's population. Farmers died in mass and left their fields fallow, causing prices to soar and famine to take even more lives. Many blamed the plague on the emperor Justinian. They named the pestilence after him and called him a demon. He himself contracted the disease but survived. Others blamed his wife, Empress Theodora, saying this was God's punishment for her promiscuity. The Justinian plague crippled the economy and disabled the empire. With the Byzantine army no longer keeping them in check, many other groups were able to expand and conquer, including the Saxons, a German group who first settled in the British Isles during this time. As abruptly as it began, the disease faded away and mostly disappeared for 800 years. The 11 and 1200s were a great time to be alive. Europe was thriving. The climate was warm, leading to longer growing seasons, and new technology like crop rotation and mills meant a surplus of food. More babies were born and survived. Plus, the Vikings, Arabs, and Magyars had stopped raiding and killing the adults. The population more than doubled in many areas. In England, 1.4 million people became 5 million, who enjoyed prosperity and relative peace. But in the spring of 1315, it all came tumbling down, literally. During a climate era known as the Little Ice Age, the clouds opened up and heavy rains fell for 26 straight months. Crops could not ripen and harvests failed. Soggy sheep and cattle developed diseases, which blighted as much as 80% of the livestock in England. The famine decimated northwestern Europe, from Poland to the Alps. Desperate, starving people turned to crime, violence, and even cannibalism. As records of the peasants were not well kept, it is hard to know the exact loss of life, but it is estimated that between 5 and 12% of the European population perished. One group which did keep very good records, the English royal family, had an average life expectancy of 35 years in 1276. During the Great Famine, it dropped to 29 years. But during the Black Death, even royals who had the best of everything could only manage to live an average of 17 years. People who survived the Great Famine, especially children, were weakened by malnutrition. They grew up with feeble bones and sometimes even rickets because they missed out on calcium and vitamin D from dairy and meat. Babies born during the famine who were lucky enough to survive were in their early 30s when the next, even greater specter of death cast its shadow across Europe. The Black Death. In 2022, archaeologists discovered a sudden surge in plague deaths in what is today Kyrgyzstan in the late 1330s. It is theorized that climate change in Central Asia caused rodents to flee dried-out grasslands and move into areas populated by humans. The Yersinia pestis bacteria they carried mutated to more easily infect people. The plague was then carried by traders along the Silk Road, where it devastated every place it went. India and Mongolia were depopulated, and the Middle East was covered in corpses. By 1343, the pestilence reached Crimea. There, the Golden Horde had the city of Kaffa under siege. When Mongol soldiers died, their corpses were catapulted over the city walls and infected the people cowering within. Genoese traders escaped the scene in their ships and unwittingly carried infected rats back home to Italy. From there, the disease launched its carnage of Europe, spreading north like wildfire. A generation already weakened by malnutrition and disease was massacred. The Black Death is estimated to have killed around 100 million people, 30% of the population in the Middle East and up to 60% of Europe. To give some perspective on the apocalyptic scale of the Black Death, the COVID-19 pandemic killed around 7 million people in a world population of 7.8 billion, meaning about 0.1% of the population died, or 1 in 1,000 people. Many of us know and mourn someone who died from this terrible disease. However, the Black Death claimed the lives of over 1 million people in a world population of only 470 million. That's about 21% and more than 1 in 5 people worldwide. Whole families were wiped out in a matter of days. Gravediggers would be called to retrieve one poor soul and be inundated with half a dozen or more who needed burial. There were not enough priests to administer last rites, and victims were buried no better than animals in mass graves. When churchyards reached capacity and there was no one left to bury the dead, corpses were left to rot in their beds or even in the streets. For those living in the midst of this horror, there could be only one explanation. It was God's punishment for the sins of the world. In this already deeply religious era, many turned to religion for salvation. The flagellants, a group of militant pilgrims, traveled through the countryside of Italy and Germany, beating and whipping themselves in punishment for the sins of humanity. Others took the opposite approach and decided that if they were going to die, they might as well go out with a bang. Taverns and brothels filled up with hedonistic fatalists making merry. Obsession with death and the afterlife dominated culture. The artistic movement of memento mori, or remember you will die, became a common theme. A skeleton draped in a black cloak and wielding a scythe to harvest souls emerged as the personification of death. He didn't actually get the name the Grim Reaper until 1847. This character called corpses of both the high and low born to dance around graves in the danse macabre, or the Dance of the Dead, a common theatrical theme. The song you've been hearing in the background of this video was written about it in 1874 by French composer Camille Saint-Saëns. During the Black Death, xenophobia surged as many feared outsiders were to blame. Cities barred their gates, and once flourishing trade ground to a halt. The idea of quarantine had been around since antiquity, but the word emerged during the Black Death to refer to the 40 days ships were required to wait in the harbor before they were allowed to dock in Venice. While these precautions were effective in preventing the spread of the disease, it easily got out of hand. Foreigners, beggars, lepers, and Romany people were driven out. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells. Jewish communities in Mainz and Cologne were annihilated, and 2,000 Jews were massacred in Strasbourg. Many flocked to Poland, where they were welcomed by King Casimir the Great. Medieval people had no way of knowing how this terrible pestilence was being transmitted. The most widely accepted theory was that it was caused by bad air, called miasmas. This is not completely off base, as many diseases, including the pneumonic plague and COVID-19, do travel in airborne droplets. But the medieval idea of carrying a bouquet of flowers or a satchel of sweet herbs to smell instead was not protective against any form of the plague. The prevailing medical theory of the time was humorism, which dictated that all ailments were the result of an imbalance of the 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. The fever, which signaled a case of plague, led doctors to believe it was a hot disease caused by too much blood and yellow bile. They used chamomile and arsenic to cool the body, and they warned people not to take hot baths or eat spicy food, advice that was not helpful. It's easy to judge people of the past as ignorant and superstitious. Of course, we know now that unsanitary conditions and an out-of-control rat population allowed the rampant spread of bacteria. But we have the hindsight of 700 years of medical knowledge, chiefly germ theory, which was developed in the 1860s. Even the microscope, invented in 1590, was far in the future. The only 2 pieces of medical advice which were actually effective against the plague were to think positively. Modern studies have shown that psychological well-being lends some protection against illness. and to get the hell out of town. This leads straight to the Decameron. In the midst of the Black Death, Giovanni Boccaccio, who lost his father and stepmother to the pestilence, penned a masterpiece. He tells of 10 young people who flee pestilence-ridden Florence and escape to their countryside villas. There, the friends distract each other from their grief and fear by telling stories. Each day, one of them is named king or queen, and it is their duty to select the food, entertainment, and theme for that day's tales. Over their 2-week retreat, the group shares stories for 10 days, plus 1 day a week for chores and another for prayer. The title of the work comes from the Greek deca, 10, and imera, day. A total of 100 stories are shared. They vary from romantic to tragic to humor to horror, and include many practical jokes and life lessons. Modern audiences who have a vision of medieval prudery might be surprised at how raunchy the Decameron tales are. Nuns passing around the handsome young convent gardener, a young woman sneaking out on the terrace to meet her lover, a wife tricking her husband into cleaning a barrel so she can have sex with her lover, and a beautiful woman luring a man into her home where he tumbles into a booby-trapped sewage pit and she robs him. Despite the stereotypes, sex was certainly enjoyed in the Middle Ages. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Though the unmarried female storytellers are concerned about their reputations, they all sing songs and tell stories about lovers, and only one of them, the youngest, is a virgin. Boccaccio writes with considerable empathy towards women and their limitations in society. 7 of the 10 storytellers are ladies, and many tales deal with strong female characters making a stand or getting revenge for injustice. The 3 young men enjoy getting a rise out of them by telling mostly bawdy, sexy stories. The action in the book takes place within the tales. The 10 narrators mostly wander around tranquil gardens and relax. They are only there to deliver the stories of escapism, none of which have to do with the plague. In the end, the book ends abruptly with the 10 nobles deciding to return home. It is left unclear what will become of them in plague-riddled Florence. But for a brief moment, they truly lived. The book's ample smut, which is often perpetrated by members of the clergy, led the text to be banned by the Vatican and burned in the bonfire of the vanities. But the Decameron, written in vernacular Tuscan rather than Latin, was a huge hit with post-plague audiences. It is considered one of the greatest works of literature and inspired Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice and All's Well That Ends Well, and many other narratives. In 1971, Pier Pasolini directed a version of the Decameron which retells 10 of the most popular tales. It is quite entertaining if you're good with subtitles and a lot of full frontal nudity. Boccaccio's original text enjoyed a resurgence in popularity in 2020, while the world quarantined during the COVID-19 pandemic. The 2024 Netflix series starts with Boccaccio's framing story of 10 nobles escaping to a Tuscan villa and takes a big leap from there. Though there are a few references to the group telling stories, the action takes place with them in the midst of the Black Death. There are still 10 main characters. Nobles Pampanea, Philomena, Nephili, and Panfilo are included, but handsome and charismatic Dioneo has been downgraded from a noble to a doctor and personal servant of Tindaro. The other 4 nobles didn't make the cut. In the original, Tindaro was a servant, but he has been upgraded to one of the more obnoxious nobles. Maisa, Lechesca, and Stratilia are maids in both versions, but in 2024 they are upgraded to main characters. The only character name which is not in the source is Sorisco. The original steward was called Parmino. Boccaccio was a wealthy man from a merchant family. His book doesn't spare much thought for how the Black Death affected the lower classes. But the truth is, they suffered much more. Nobles and merchants had the means to stay home and lock their doors, or flee to country estates, while the working class were stuck toughing it out in overcrowded cities. The servants in the Decameron did have the opportunity to get away from Florence. But while their employers were sharing witticisms in whimsical, well-ventilated gardens, the staff was busy roasting their suckling pigs and preparing their morning cheeses, while crammed in hot kitchens which were often infested with rats. Across the infected world, the old, young, men and women died at the same rate. The only factor that offered any protection was being rich. More than half of the peasants of London died, while only 22% of English barons were cut down. In the recent retelling, making half of the main characters servants allows for social commentary on how inequality often determines who lives and who dies. The gender imbalance of the 14th century is also on full display, with the single ladies desperate to marry a nobleman, any nobleman, in order to secure a place in society and the chance to stay at the villa. Their survival literally depended on a man. In the original, this power dynamic is an accepted part of life, though Boccaccio does have some sympathy for female characters and allows them their petty pranks rather than actual social change. The queer themes in the modern version are less obvious in the original. However, Nephele and Pamphilos's storyline of a frustrated woman married to a closeted gay man, both of whom turn to lovers for satisfaction, is taken directly from the 10th tale told on the 5th day. The 5th tale, told on the 4th day, also contains an anecdote of someone being unable to move a whole corpse and only bringing back the head, which also happens in the retelling. I won't spoil the ending, but in the show, the plague itself and the social chaos it sparks play a much bigger role in the fates of the 10 Decamerons. The Great Pestilence suddenly faded out in 1353, after ravaging Eurasia for 7 years. It is still not clear why it ceased. The prevailing theory is that everyone who was susceptible had already died. Those who remained had either fallen ill and survived or had a natural immunity. In 2022, scientists studying the DNA of plague victims in Smithfield, London, discovered that those who survived have genetic variants, which supercharge their immune systems. These mutations are still in the gene pool. Everyone alive today who has Eurasian or North African heritage descends from plague survivors. A study found that about 45% of British people have this superimmunity gene. Though their bodies are ready to fight off the next wave of bubonic plague, should it ever emerge, the gene has its downsides. Overactive immune systems cause a number of autoimmune disorders, including Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. Survivors of the Black Death faced a radically changed world. There was more demand for labor than there were people to do it. Peasants abandoned the lands their family had been tied to for generations in search of better pay, and many of them got it, becoming wealthier than ever before. The infuriated nobles posed laws limiting everything from where peasants could live to what kinds of clothes they could wear. In England, the government issued a tax, but they didn't understand that the population had shrunk, so when they didn't raise as much as they expected, they taxed everyone again. Peasants revolted in England, France, and other parts of Europe. Thus began centuries of class warfare, which would eventually culminate in the end of feudalism. This new migration around the country led to the emergence of surnames. Before the Black Death, everyone in a village knew who John was, but now people needed to know if you were John the Baker or John the Smith. Many lost trust in the church, as the priests they had begged for mercy were impotent to help. In fact, nuns and monks who lived in close quarters died at higher rates. This loss of faith planted the seeds for the Protestant Reformation. Some areas laid abandoned for decades. Central Asia, with its fertile fields, was once filled with thriving cities, which never fully recovered. In Egypt, a great deal of labor was needed to irrigate the desert. With half of the farmers dead, harvests failed, and one of the wealthiest nations became one of the poorest. Some areas welcomed migrants and thrived. Prague actually doubled in size. Overall, it took 150 years for the population of Europe to return to pre-Black Death levels, and this recovery was greatly hindered by the recurring waves of bubonic plague. Edinburgh, Scotland, with its narrow, overcrowded streets, was hit with no less than 11 outbreaks. In 1666, the Great Plague of London killed more than 100,000 people. In 3 centuries, medical science hadn't developed any more effective remedies for the plague. But doctors, or those posing as doctors, continued to get rich selling false hope to the dying. They protected themselves by wearing distinct costumes of ankle-length waxed overcoats, gloves, boots, hoods, and bird-like beaked masks. They filled the beaks with herbs and spices to ward off foul miasmas. While this effort was in vain, completely covering the skin did prevent flea access, so this historic PPE was actually effective. The last plague pandemic in Western Europe hit Marseille, France in 1720 and killed over 100,000 people. The world faced its last plague pandemic in 1850. Infection began in the Yunnan province of China and spread across Asia. 10 million people died in India alone. The British colonial government imposed quarantine, isolation camps, travel restrictions, and banned traditional medicine. These tyrannical measures contributed to unrest and rebellion. In 1894, French-Swiss bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin, a protégé of Louis Pasteur, identified the Yersinia pestis bacteria. Thus, the plague's spread via infected fleas carried on rodents was finally understood. The introduction of insecticides reduced the spread of the disease. Russian scientist Valdemar Hofkin developed a vaccine and used Indian prisoners for human trials. It was effective and saved millions of lives. In the 1910s, the first antibiotics were developed. Yersinia pestis is still active in many rodent populations. It has even been found in prairie dogs in North America, and it has occasionally infected humans. But unlike a virus such as COVID-19, bacterial infections can now be easily treated with antibiotics, assuming Yersinia pestis never evolves an antibiotic-resistant strain. With luck and modern science, the world will never again face the horrors of the Black Death. But it is worth remembering these wise words from the Decameron. Life is made of sweet things, and so it is worth the price we pay for it. In next week's video, we'll explore the lives and tragic deaths of royals who died from the plague, including a sultan whose mysterious illness was mistaken for poison, and his wife got the blame, a future king of England whose untimely demise was a crucial cause of the Wars of the Roses, and an Italian king whose sudden death freed up his wife to rule her own way. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast. A special thank you goes to my patrons, Sydney Ford and Kristen Ryden. Don't want to wait to see the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all of my multi-part series. If you would like to join my Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos, click on the link in the description. Thank you for watching.